Hello everyone, good morning and you're welcome back. In today's video, I'm going to give you different phrases you can use in place of how are you. How are you is a very common phrase used by a lot of people to check up on someone, to know how they're faring, to know how they're doing. But it's just commonly used, and today I'm going to give you different ways you can say how are you. You can mean the same thing but in a different way. Alright, so first of all, I'm going to give you 3 ways that you can use how are you. The casual way, the formal way, and then the funny way. So if you're interested in this lesson, you stick around. Let's go. The casual way of saying how are you. Number 1, instead of saying how are you, you can say how are you doing? How are you doing? And if you ask how are you doing, it is grammatically incorrect for you to say I'm doing well. No, you say I'm doing great or I'm doing good. Okay, I'm doing good. Instead of I'm doing well, you say I'm doing good. The next phrase you can use in place of how are you is how have you been? Maybe you've not seen the person for a while. You can say, how have you been? Instead of saying, how are you? Alright? And then you can say, I have been great or I have been good. I have been great or I have been good. Alright? So that's another way you can say, how are you? Alright? Without actually using how are you phrase. Another phrase you can use in place of how are you is, what's going on? What's going on? Maybe you're asking the person to know what the person has been up to, what the person has been doing. So instead of just starting with how are you, the common phrase, you can actually say, what's going on? And the person should respond, nothing much. Nothing much. So another phrase you can use instead of how are you is, what's new? What's new with you? What's new with you? Or what's new? Alright, so instead of saying how are you, you say what's new? What's new with you? I think that's a very nice one too. What's new with you? Another phrase I also like and I use more often is what's up? What's up? I like that so much. I'll just say, just bump into your DM and I'll say, what's up? Yeah, I like that too. That's another way to say, how are you? Okay, you can say, what's up? And then another way, but in this one, is a kind of mischievous one. Maybe the person is up to some mischief or something. So you can say, what have you been up to? What have you been up to? Yes, instead of saying how are you, you can say what have you been up to. Don't forget, this is a casual way of saying how are you. Another way of saying how are you is, how are things going? How are things going? Okay, maybe you've not seen the person for a while or in a while. You've not heard from the person. You can just say, how are things going? Instead of how are you. How are things going? Alright. The next phrase you can actually use in place of how are you is, how are you feeling? How are you feeling? Now, this could be the person was ill. Alright. So instead of saying how are you, you can just say, how are you feeling? That's another way to say, how are you? Another way to, you can say, how are you is, how is everything? How is everything? That's another way of saying, how are you? Another way you can say, how are you is, how are things? Wow, this one is very casual. How are things? And if I'm the one to respond, I'll say, things good. Things good. Another way we can say, how are you is, how is life? How is life? How is life? Life's good. Yes, that's another interesting way of saying, how are you? Another way of saying, how are you is, how's your day been? Or how's your day going? Okay, you can actually use this in place of, how are you? How's your day going? We are done with the casual way of saying, how are you? Now we're going to dive into the formal way of saying, how are you? And the very first one I love so much, I use this with my pupils a whole lot, is, how do you do? How do you do? And the correct response to this is not, I am fine, thank you. No. The correct response to this is, how do you do? How do you do? How do you do? Interesting, right? That's the correct thing to say. And then the next formal way to say, how are you? Is, how do you fare? How do you fare? This is a very interesting way to say, how do you do? In a formal setting, you say, how do you fare? And then another way is, are you well? Are you well? That's another way to say, how are you? In a very formal way, okay? Are you well? Another way to say, how do you do is, how are things going along? Maybe you want to know how things are going along in the office, or what's going on in the office or in your establishment. You can actually say, how are things going along? Things are going along very well. Or, things are going in a smooth way. Yes. Another way to say, how are you in a formal way is, how is your health? Maybe your employee is not feeling well or has been away from work due to one illness or the other. Instead of saying, how are you, you can say, how's your health? Remember, these are other options of saying, how are you? How is your health? So now let's go. The funny way of saying, how are you? Okay, the first one I use this often, is howdy. It's a funny way, howdy. And then the second one is, how is it hanging? How is it hanging? Another funny way of saying, how are you is, how is tricks? How is tricks? Yes, it's a funny way of saying, how are you? Sometimes the American people, even the British, use this so well. How is tricks? And then finally we have, what's sizzling? What's sizzling? Yes, what's sizzling? That's another way of saying, how are you? Okay, so we've come to the end of today's lesson, and I hope that from today you have a whole lot of options: the casual way, the formal way, and the funny way of saying, how are you? And I hope you try these options, and then you let me know in the comment section if you love them and all the ways you can say, how are you, that you know. Alright, please give this video a thumbs up and share if you can. Thank you so much for watching, and see you in my next video. Bye.